As painters, I think we all learned early on that the most important part about painting is to learn to see as an artist. We learned how to see our subject in terms of big masses, big shapes, which sets up the composition. It gives us the big shapes and values and color relationships, much easier to deal with big shapes and masses. But then the problem or the struggle becomes, how do we break up those big shapes, or how do we finish this big design of big shapes that works so well? And we can really mess up that design with the large masses by adding too much detail or breaking up those big shapes into too many smaller shapes. So that's the struggle. How do we finish a painting without overdoing it, but yet we need to add some refinement to those big shapes? So that's what I want to do in this video, is talk about how to refine that block-in stage. That's so important. Again, we've taken the busy landscape scene and reduced it to just the 5 to 8 big masses and shapes. We got the right value relationships, but now do we need to refine it or finish it? What parts do I add more detail to? Or what parts do I just use broken color, which is same value as the big shape, but just different color? Detail is creating smaller value changes in the big shapes. And too much of that can really kill the painting. So in this video, I want to talk about some tips and techniques that help you refine and finish the painting.
We spend so much time talking about big shapes, no subtleties, reducing a scene like this into 6 or 7 large shapes with real simple value changes, just a simple dark and light, because that sets up everything, sets up the composition, the sense of light, gets us away from focusing on detail and thinking more about value and composition, and using colors that suggest light. But after that block in, after we get it filled in, we need to think about subtleties. Subtleties in value between those big shapes or in those big shapes, and subtle color changes also. When we do that, we still want to keep those large shapes or that feel of the large shapes. So something like this, the scene is slightly backlit. It's maybe 2 in the afternoon, but the sun's in front a little bit. So I have a lot of darks here on everything that's vertical. That's why I tend to look, not everything has to be backlit, but when it is, you have the uprights pretty dark, and you have the more flatter planes. These aren't really flat, but they're smaller bushes and tall grasses. Those flatter planes are really light, and you get instant contrast, and you can see it in here between the shrubbery and the flat planes. And that sets up a lot of contrast. It helps me to simplify shapes better. When the sun is behind me, things are flattened out. There isn't as much contrast. The difference is just between the different dark colors and light colors. I might have a light colored grass and dark colored trees. So my value differences are just in separating the planes. But here, because of light, everything vertical is a lot darker and everything flat is a little lighter. And the slanted are usually somewhat in between. And the sky is the lightest because I'm almost looking into the sun, so it's going to be very light. I need to find, first of all, before I think subtlety, those big flat areas. And this simplifies things, forcing myself to pick a value and color to suggest what the values or what the light's doing. And again, more about value than color. I can change the color in all these big shapes, and as long as the value's right, it's still going to work. But then I come to the place where I want some subtlety. And by the way, I didn't simplify this a lot. There's a lot of little smaller shapes of dark and light in here. But that's kind of why I took the photograph. I like that broken foreground of all those shrubbery. But I did simplify it more than what I saw. I pulled it together to make it a little bit easier to render. So when the viewer looks at it, it's not just a jumbled mess. It has some order to it based on dark and light. So now the subtlety comes, and I want to break up looking at darks first, I want to break up darker areas with any kind of subtle color change. Doesn't have to be what I see exactly. I might see some of the color changes within the big shadow areas and use those, or I might not, and I pick whatever color I want. Sometimes I can, this is a muted blue-green, blue with a little bit of yellow and maybe some orange or red, and that gives me a muted blue-green. I might get the same value with a stronger blue-green, or I might go to a blue-violet to emphasize the temperature. Or I could go warmer and scrub in more kind of reddish oranges to show maybe some reflected light in there. So as long as I have a reason for the color I'm going to break these darks up with, doesn't matter what it is. Again, I can think more temperature or just little bit darker for a little bit of a value change. So the changes, I made some changes on these. Remember, at the computer, there's no blending. At least with me on the computer, there's no blending. It's pretty much just flat. But I'm not worried about blending. With the oil, we're going to be blending. But I got a little bit of color changes, especially in the background here. I've got actually just more of a value change, slightly lighter. But the value in this large dark shape in the mountain does not force me to lose that overall simple shape. It just breaks it up a little bit. Now, the more I break it up, the more it can be lost. Same thing in the shadows here, just a couple of different colors on these trees in the background. Shadow in here, I've got a color or two. Again, with oil paint, you're going to get more blending, but lights too. I started with that basic green there and adding some value change. These greens, stronger yellow greens here, are a little bit lighter, but these are closer to the same value. And that helps break it up. It gives it a little more sense of form. Makes it look more three-dimensional and adds more interest. But I do step over a line after a while and get too broken up, too many values, but I don't want to do that. Now, the nice thing about the oils is when I put like this violet on top of this muted green, they blend together and it creates a subtle change. The computer, it's not that subtle unless I get just real close to the value. But it creates more interest, more dynamic colors vibrating next to each other, as opposed to just the one or the two dark and light values and colors for each of the shapes. I mean, that works, but this creates a little bit more interest. And I can decide to push the color stronger, like I have down here, or make it grayer. I added some grayer colors in there. So think through different ways to create some subtle color and value changes. The value changes are mostly here just the darker accents in the shadow. So I go from this value of the tree here to some darker accents. Probably have a little bit darker down in here as well. And I added some darker value changes down here. So, and like anything else, the more you do it, the more you get a feel for how to make those changes. Now this scene here, I didn't do anything to this, but this one, the large shapes are real evident. You can just almost outline them. Fill them in with that one bluish green, yellow green. So the shapes are really separated here. So what I would want to focus on is how much subtlety can I get in that yellow green. Go from a yellow green to a yellow orange, reddish orange, maybe a little bit of cool color, some blue green in there. As long as it's somewhat the same value, then some dark accents, some subtle value changes from some values in the background. The grass, too, is a good example, picking one blue-green in there. Again, I have to make it a different value than this blue-green. They look about the same in the photo, but I have to decide which one's going to be lighter and which one's darker. And the key is just don't make them both the same. But after that bluish green, I get a little stronger green. I get a violet, got kind of a reddish orange in there. It's all roughly the same value, maybe a touch lighter. If I go darker, then it becomes a value change, like these dark value changes here. But push the color. Don't paint only broken color or subtle color changes that you see in the photograph, because the photograph's not very good with recording subtle colors. Some are. This has some, but standing there I saw a lot more. So it is important to go out and really look and observe, even if you don't paint much. But if nothing else, I can take color notes. I can take a palette out there and I can mix colors, see what kind of variations I see. And as long as it stays within this big range, you know, the dark, or this range of the light, I can break it up, add some variation. But the minute I add so much that I lose those big shapes, those big masses, then I've gone too far. And this one, first of all, this has a lot going on with it, especially on the barn here where you see all those stripes of different browns, all the color variation in here. So I want to pull it together first. You really have to ignore those subtle changes. As nice as they look, you have to ignore them for quite a while until you get things blocked in. Trees are simplified quite a bit, and so is the grass. So my simplification here is picking a color, and this is more of a muted red-orange. Cadmium orange, and a little bit of alizarin, Orchid Red Deep, and a touch of blue to mute it. And the same colors, just darker and less white for the shadow. And that gives me the big shapes that I can paint into. And I want this paint thick enough here and here, all these areas, that when I paint back into it, the paint will blend. Those subtle color and value changes will blend, because I don't want anything really to stick out very much, especially in the shadow. But then the subtleties here, if we go over each one, let's start with this roof right here. And again, this is my main color. I've got a little bit lighter for some color variation, and then a touch darker and a little bit stronger color. If I'm using a gray color as the base color, the block-in color, then I can use stronger color to break it up. And the opposite is true. If I use a real strong color as a base color to block it in, then I can use grayer color to break it up. And it doesn't matter which one. It depends on what it is. The barn here is old. I want the roof to be kind of grayer, so I'll start grayer as a base color to block in. Then I'll add stronger color like I did these two violets to kind of break it up. And again, with oil paint, that's going to blend better. In the foreground here, I had a grayer base, that gray reddish orange, red orange with some blue in it. Now it's just stronger color and some value change. This is definitely lighter. This is definitely darker, but they're a bit stronger, not quite as muted because I started out muted. If I get too much muted on top of muted, it's not going to have much punch color-wise. But that combination of gray and at least a little bit stronger color really helps. I didn't do too much to the shadow over here, but I could. Trees also, after hitting just a basic dark and light, get some dark accents below. And, you know, I could get a little cooler color in here. I won't be covering up this kind of darker green, but I will affect it with a little bit of more blue-green or blue-violet, just to push it into the shadow a bit more. You're thinking outside the box when you do those subtleties, those subtle value and color changes. And if you think of this as practice, you'll learn so much more. You'll mess up more paintings. But they should be practice paintings anyway, 6x8, 8x10, 9x12, where you're just blocking in and then playing with breaking up the color. I would say don't worry about composition and just start, get some shapes down there of something, some subject matter. Block it in and start breaking up the color. But the minute you start doing that, composition starts to slide. So I always want to think in terms of composition. Never just throw composition out just to practice values or color. Always try and at least arrange a composition that works. Looking at a couple of paintings here. This is a painting by Camille Groupé. And he's got a lot of subtlety here in the snow. You see all the color change in the shadows here in the light areas. A lot of nice color variation. Even, of course, in the water also. 3 or 4 different colors, 2 or 3 different values. But when you look at the whole thing, the values are still simple. The big shapes are still simple. He's just broken them up. And you can see the strong blue, the red-orange. A lot of variation of color in there. And if we take this, and I'm going to desaturate it, I'm going to lose all the color. That variation, the color variation disappears. And where it was just a subtle color change, not a value change, you can't tell any difference. But you can see some of the value changes in the snow here and in the water, a little bit back here in the background. But I still want to keep it simple, even as I break things up. Now this is a Willard Metcalf, and again, he's really simplified shapes here. Shape of the water, shape of the grass in here, grass shape here, and then the shape of the vertical trees, hillside trees background. So I don't know, 7, 8 big shapes, but there's a lot of variation of color here, variation of color in the water, a lot of variation here in the background here. It's real subtle. Same thing back in here. There's not tons of it, but the more you look at it, the more color you'll see. I saw this painting in the Metropolitan in New York, and it's a big painting. He tended to chop in color as he went along. He didn't start with a big, I don't know what he did all the time, but you can tell because of a lot of the bare canvas showing through, he just started chopping in color. But he could judge the values and simplify the shapes really well, because the big shapes still stand out when you squint. Or if we turn this to a black and white, big shapes still stand out. Water shape, ground shape here on the left, ground shape on the right, middle ground, trees and hill, and then the background hills. There's a lot of broken up small value changes and small color changes. It still holds together as big, simple shapes. It doesn't fall apart into tons of little detail. This is Carl Moll, M-O-L-L. He was an Austrian painter. Really good with simplifying the landscape. You can see the simple shapes. But then, this one value back in here has several different colors. A few different values, but a lot of different colors back in there. Same thing in the sidewalk, in the shadow and the sunlight, a lot of color variation. And in the tree, some value and color variation. But the key is the big shapes still hold together. They aren't so broken up that the plane separation falls apart. Still reads simple, but has a lot more interest in it because of the broken color or subtle color and value changes.